Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we have an NBA champion. Plus, Kevin Durant was traded. It was a huge Sunday in the league. We'll also talk about will the Wolves trade 17 or 31 on Wednesday night and Thursday night's NBA draft? Which pick are they more likely to keep? We'll talk about another option for them. A guy who's often mocked somewhere between those two picks. So a packed show today. Lots to get into. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you had a fantastic weekend. We'll talk about the events of the NBA here in the first segment. Went down on Sunday. Yes, we'll talk briefly, give some kudos to the OKC Thunder, but mostly want to talk Kevin Durant trade and what impact, the return that Phoenix got for him from the Rockets, how that impacts Minnesota in the context of what they were rumored to have offered, and then also the Western Conference of the NBA overall, the landscape of the league and the conference specifically. And then we'll talk some draft stuff, lots to get to on the draft side. Of course, first round is Wednesday night, second round Thursday night. And that is what we're going to spend the entire week talking about here after this first segment, putting a bow on the Durant trade saga. A big thank you off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and it's available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves, and you can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right, so Kevin Durant was traded on Sunday, and I had been saying on the show for a while I didn't think Minnesota would end up with him even a couple weeks ago when it seemed like they could be the front runners. Then, of course, all the news about Durant apparently not having a desire to sign an extension in Minnesota, and apparently reporting is that at the deadline, Minnesota thought that Durant was interested, and it sounds like this was a game of telephone through the Suns, and it sounds like Phoenix's front office could have been any less trustworthy, which, maybe not the most surprising thing that happened in this whole saga. And of course, Durant and also maybe Durant didn't fully know what he wanted, which also wasn't surprising because that's kind of the MO of both parties here. So Durant ends up going to Houston. It became pretty clear that it was important to him to, in some order, play somewhere ideally that was warm and ideally didn't have state income tax, right? We talked about Houston, we talked about Miami, and we talked about the other team from Texas that I'm somehow now blanking on. But three teams that all don't have income tax in the states that they're in, and that was clearly something that was a motivating factor for him. At one point, Dallas, of course, was involved, but or Dallas was a rumored a team to have rumored interest. But what Houston ended up giving up for Kevin Durant, I actually really like the trade for Houston. Like for the beginning of the offseason, I was a bit dubious about the Rockets, doing the whole the cashing in your chips that everybody's talking about for a team. It was the number 2 seed this year and very easily could have ended up in the conference finals. I mean, if they beat Golden State, does that Houston team beat Minnesota in a 7-game series? They very well could have. And we'd be talking a lot differently about Houston coming into the offseason versus what ended up happening to them against Golden State in round 1. But for them to acquire Kevin Durant, and I know he's 37, but he's still one of the best scorers in the league and a top 25 player. For them to acquire him for, Jalen Green, Dylan Brooks, the number 10 pick in this year's draft, which is maybe arguably the best asset of the group, and several second rounders, which obviously matters. Wolves have done pretty well acquiring second rounders in the Tim Conley era as well, as just kind of like nobody talks about him, but then it's like, oh, it's nice that we have these second rounders that we're taking Jalen Clark with, right? But Houston, I think, did pretty well for this. Like if you're going to trade for 37-year-old Kevin Durant and ultimately, I'm sure, hand him an extension, then I would have expected them to have to trade somebody else on this roster. Not that like Amen Thompson was ever really on the table in a deal like this. Not that not that they were going to trade. They were going to trade Alperen Şengün, right? Like that wasn't going to happen. But that was also kind of, I was worried that could happen. If you're a Houston fan, that could have, something crazy like that, you could have been like, all right, we have to get Kevin Durant no matter what to add to this roster. We're not going to trade both of those guys, obviously, but one of them could be on the table. Like it if I were a Rockets fan, I would have a huge sigh of relief over the fact that all you're giving up is Jalen Green, who's overpaid on the contract he's on, that massive 3-year deal that didn't make any sense. I always thought he was overrated as a prospect and has been as a pro. Dillon Brooks, who's a nice player, but he's kind of a fringy starter, a really good defender, but the offense just isn't what it needs to be. And there's, obvious Dillon Brooks is an important culture piece. He's a classic, first team Pat Beverly of like, you love him if he's on your team, you hate him if he's not, sort of a thing. There's also other issues going on with Dillon Brooks, but like from a culture standpoint, from a playing hard, play defense really hard all the time, and being an actual like not functional, like a top flight defender, he has value as well. Like those are both valuable pieces. I would actually rank the assets, the number 10 pick, Dillon Brooks, and then Jalen Green, because the Jalen Green contract. If you're Phoenix, you obviously are trying to restock the cupboard, and who knows what happens with Bradley Beal and ultimately Devin Booker, although I think Booker stays for now, whereas Beal could, who knows? Like he probably isn't on the roster come fall. But Jalen Green gets a bit of a fresh start. There's obviously still offensive talent, their athleticism, etc. And then the pick, it's a pretty good draft. And you see what happens at number 10, and then Dillon Brooks raises your floor defensively. Like what Minnesota was rumored to have been offering, or at least been discussing with Phoenix, would have involved Rudy Gobert. And Rudy Gobert is the ultimate floor raiser. We've talked about this before. He's a walking top 10 defense. And Phoenix would have been a top 10 defense had they acquired Rudy Gobert. Dillon Brooks doesn't have that big of an impact as a one individual player as Rudy Gobert would on a team's defense, but he will have an impact. And he will change the culture, which is clearly one of, like, nobody's played perimeter defense on the Phoenix Suns over the last couple of years. And, you have a pair of veteran coaches in Frank Vogel and Mike Budenholzer, and those guys can get this roster to play defense. Now, Dillon Brooks is going to play defense. He's going to come in and defend. And Jalen Green has some upside, and I get the swing if you're Phoenix, and I get getting the pick. So it's not a horrendous haul if you're Phoenix. Haul is probably not the right word. It's not a horrendous return. It is not as good as what they could have gotten from Minnesota had Kevin Durant been willing to sign an extension with the Timberwolves. And I don't know exactly what the Wolves offer looked like, but it would have had to have included either an opted-in Julius Randle or Rudy Gobert. Very likely it was Gobert, possibly DiVincenzo or Mike Conley, and, future picks, whatever, second rounders, I guess, mostly. Or I guess it probably was this year's number 17 pick and then future second rounders. That, if you're Phoenix, is a better return than, but I'm pretty confident, and the reporting was kind of around this, that Minnesota was like, we're not doing this if he doesn't agree to the extension. And I bet if he had agreed to an extension, a trade could have gotten done with Minnesota. But without that assurance, you're not going to trade Rudy Gobert or Julius Randle, for that matter, if you're Minnesota. So the way that this went down, I don't hate it for either side, given Phoenix was between a rock and a hard place, and a lot of that was their own doing. But this trade was going to happen. Durant mostly gets what he wants. Houston didn't give up too much, and Phoenix did okay. Like, I actually think everybody wins in this scenario as much as they could, given the situation. It was kind of a moderate win for everybody. I want to talk about what it does to the landscape of the Western Conference. Does it help Minnesota or hurt Minnesota? So we'll do that here next, and then we'll move on and talk a little bit more specifically about the draft and then about Minnesota's picks. We will cover one draft prospect today as well. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at OLIPOP. OLIPOP is a new kind of soda made for people who love the classic taste of soda, but want something that supports their health. With just 2 to 5 grams of sugar and 9 grams of prebiotic fiber in every can, OLIPOP is reimagining soda in a way that is better for your gut. Traditional sodas are loaded with sugar, like 39 grams in a regular Coke or 44 grams in an orange Fanta. I have a vintage cola right here from OLIPOP. Right here. And guess what? just a fraction of the sugar, no artificial sweeteners, gut-friendly ingredients like Ollie Smart. Look at it right now. It's only 35 calories. Only 35 calories. I'm talking about 39 grams of sugar in Coke. Only 2 grams of sugar in this vintage cola from OLIPOP. My favorite flavor is classic grape. I had that on the show last week. I drank it on the show last week. It was fantastic. Delicious to crack open an OLIPOP and really any of the flavors. But again, classic grape, my favorite, tastes just as good and actually better than any grape soda I've ever had. I'm not a massive soda person. OLIPOP's gotten me back into it, but not back into all the other stuff, just into OLIPOP. It's absolutely delicious. Get a free can of OLIPOP. Just buy any 2 cans in the store, and they will reimburse you for one of them. Head to drinkolipop.com/LockedOnNBA. Super easy to do. drinkolipop.com/LockedOnNBA to claim your free can and find OLIPOP near you. That's drinkolipop.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, let's talk about the impact of the Kevin Durant trade on the Western Conference. I think it's pretty clear that it makes Houston better and in some ways accelerates their timeline. They get to keep their superstars and Thompson and Şengün and superstars, an aggressive word, stars, we'll call it. And it's also going to open up some playing time for guys like Tari Eason, of course, had injury issues. I like Tari Eason a lot. Reid Shepard, high first round pick last year, like he's going to get an opportunity to play potentially now. And that's not necessarily immediately good for the Rockets. Unless, Tari Eason, maybe. I think Tari Eason is NBA ready to be a legit contributor on a playoff team. And again, this is a team that has a coach that has a track record of success and a team that was legitimately the number 2 seed in the Western Conference last year. So we know that if this made them better, they are contenders for the Western Conference title, right? Like sitting here right now, you look at the best teams in the West, it's OKC, obviously. We didn't even talk about this. We didn't even talk about the OKC title. I meant to talk about this up the top. I didn't mean to bury this in segment 2. Congrats to the Thunder. I don't know what else to say about this. Like everybody expected them to win the title from pretty early on this season. It was either going to be them or Boston, and I picked them to beat the Pacers in 6. It took the Pacers 7 to do it. Obviously terrible that Tyrese Haliburton appears to have torn his Achilles. It's awful. Congrats to OKC. They're going to be a bear in the Western Conference here over the next several years, right? Like OKC, and then in some order, it's got to be Houston and Minnesota are next, like in that next tier of teams. I mean, obviously the Wolves being to the last 2 conference finals, Dallas being the other team and looking very dramatically different than they did last year. You could talk about the Lakers with Luka, but they've got a lot of stuff to figure out. Everybody's got stuff to figure out. And as competitive as the Western Conference is, Houston is right there in the same tier as Minnesota. I think you have to consider that to be the case. And this trade, I don't think necessarily is good or bad for Minnesota. It's good in the sense they didn't give up a ton of assets for a Durant rental. I mean, I've felt strongly about that the entire time. But I don't necessarily think that Durant going to Houston, well, it makes the Rockets better. I don't think it hurts Minnesota's chances to come out of the Western Conference next year. It may hurt OKC more than, and that's a weird phrase to say considering they're fresh off of a title at less than 24 hours ago. And, does the Rockets acquired Durant hurt OKC? Really? Not, no, but it probably impacts OKC more than it impacts Minnesota. And I don't mean that in a recency bias way of the Wolves crushed Durant over the last, this regular season and swept him in the playoffs the year before, because it's more than just that. But I think Minnesota is better equipped to handle a player like Durant defensively and than OKC. And Minnesota struggled with the way the Rockets played last year, and they're not going to play the same way with no Dillon Brooks and even no Jalen Green. Not that Jalen Green is a defensive stopper, but Dillon Brooks is, and they're both athletic. They both play, they both wreak havoc on both ends of the floor. And that identity is going to shift a little with Houston. Now, obviously, Ime Udoka is going to get this team playing hard, and Durant, I think, will play hard as he can, given his age and some of those limitations. But I don't think, Minnesota struggled more with last year's version of the Rockets, and I think they will struggle with this new version of the Rockets with Kevin Durant. As much as it makes the Rockets an overall better team, it probably helps them more in the playoffs than it does in the regular season. And it helps them more in other matchups, potentially the Thunder matchup, than it does against Minnesota. Of course, Phoenix is worse. We knew that. They already were kind of a non-factor this year anyway. But I don't know, like if he had ended up in Minnesota, there would have been a lot of additional questions, like what happens next, given whatever the Wolves would have ultimately given up for Kevin Durant. But I think everybody kind of wins here, and I think it's neutral for Minnesota, maybe even a win for Minnesota if you consider the potential opportunity cost to acquire KD if the Wolves had done that. I think it lifts Houston as much as it could, as much as they could have hoped, given what they gave up. And I think it's neutral to good for Minnesota. It's very odd. It's kind of a win all the way around, which is like, I didn't necessarily feel that way about like, I usually don't feel that way. Sometimes it's the opposite. Like in the moment last year, I kind of felt like maybe for the Knicks and Wolves in the Randle Cat trade, that both teams might have gotten a little bit worse. And as it turns out, they both got a little bit better. Well, the Wolves didn't actually get better, but they got back to the conference finals, even though they won 7 less games in the regular season. And obviously the Knicks got better. So it's funny. Like you see these things in real time, and it's we don't know, but I kind of like it for everybody, given the fact this trade was going to have to happen at some point anyway. Which brings me to the next thing I want to talk about, which is the NBA draft, the picks Minnesota has. We've talked about it quite a bit over the last few weeks. They've got number 17 and number 31. This year's draft, there's obviously a difference between 17 and 31. And in fact, that difference is like 14 picks, of course. But like between 10, which is what Phoenix just acquired from Houston, and 17, there's maybe not a massive gap. There's a lot of guys that are getting mocked in like at like 11 and 12 that are also getting mocked in the low 20s. So there's a lot of beauty in the eye of the beholder stuff going on. There is in every draft, but this draft feels like there's a ton of guys in the basically 10 to 35 range that you look at 5 mocks and they have them going in very distinctly different places. And one of the guys I'm going to talk about today is a good example of that, or the guy I'm going to talk about next segment is a good example of that. But I've said all along, I'd be shocked if Minnesota selected and kept guys at both 17 and 31. I've also said all along, I thought Minnesota would probably, I've said all along they'll trade one of the 2 picks, and that I thought 31 would have just as much value as 17 because of the whole, it's the NFL effect of between day 1 and day 2, inevitably somebody who many people thought was a lottery talent is going to slide out of the first round, and that first pick of the second round, everyone's going to be tripping over themselves to trade and acquire that pick. They'll talk themselves into a guy that slid, and they want the pick from Minnesota who picks first on day 2. Now, I think Minnesota will ultimately, I still think they draft somebody at 17. And there was actually an article by Chris Hine over at the Star Tribune about this the other day, and he talked about how he thinks Minnesota. Chris Hine said that he thinks Minnesota will try and the opposite of actually what I just said. He thinks they're more likely to keep 31 and trade 17 because of the salary attached to it. Right, the salary slot for the 17th pick is $4.2 million, which could make it more difficult to keep Naz, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Julius Randle and stay below the second apron. That's 100% true, and it's on the table that they're able to trade 17 and keep 31. But I think the trade value of 31 will be so high that it wouldn't shock me if they took someone at 17 and then waited to see what happens with 31 overnight. And maybe it's they hang on to the guy at 17 and then they see how things play out, and they either keep him and figure out the salary thing along the way. And perhaps it's you say goodbye to Alexander Walker because somebody they really like is there at 17, and you trade 31 for a future first, which is what I thought they'd do all along. You could trade this year's 31 pick. I am very confident that pick could be traded for a future first round pick because it's basically a first round pick this year anyway. And Minnesota doesn't have first round picks for the next several years after this year. So it makes a lot of sense to trade it for, a top 10 protected pick next year or something like that. I think that's what happens. And perhaps they keep the guy at 17. Perhaps they trade him and they end up with no rookies that they select this season. They've already got a pretty young roster this side of Rudy Gobert and Mike Conley. It's a pretty young roster. So that's also on the table here where they could pick somebody at 17 overnight, decide that they're going to trade 31 and then either keep or trade whoever it was they drafted at 17. I think that's 100% on the table. There's also trading back from 17 to try and reduce that salary. That's actually, and I'm going to make ultimate predictions here on Tuesday and Wednesday shows. I'm going to do a full draft board, not a full draft board, my Wolves draft board of like 12 to 15 guys. But sitting here right now, I bet what happens is Minnesota trades back from 17, picks up a future second to try and reduce that, right? As you trade down in the draft slot, the hold essentially decreases. So if you trade 17, you pick up a future second round pick and you get back into like the 23, 25 range or whatever. I don't know who has those picks, but into the 20s, then you save money against the cap. You maybe are saving some money you can spend on Nickeil Alexander-Walker and staying below the second apron, which is imperative. And you pick up a future asset and you still have 31 that you could trade overnight prior to round 2 on Thursday and acquire a future first round pick. That's what they're going to try and do. How many assets can we squeeze out of this thing while still staying underneath that second apron? Can we acquire a future first? And can we get, if there's somebody we really like in this draft, can we get that guy in the 20s versus at 17 and pay him less money? That is undoubtedly what Tim Conley wants to do. I want to talk about a guy who actually probably, I think, will go in that 20s range. Might not be there at 31. You might not want to draft him at 17 because there's some development to be done. Next up here, we're going to talk about Adou Thiero. It's all coming up here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it is easy to lose track. And that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. When I started using Monarch Money, I realized how much I was spending on food delivery. It is a bugaboo for me. I do it. Basketball season, summer, I do it all the time. Late on Friday, I get hungry, whatever, order stuff on food delivery. But now I know exactly how much I'm spending because of Monarch Money, and I can budget smarter and save more. The other huge benefit for this is the all-in-one convenience that instead of juggling multiple apps, you can use Monarch to check your finances, track spending, and even plan your long-term goals. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNBA for half off your first year. All right. So what I've been doing over the last couple of weeks, if you are a newish listener, is previewing 2 to 3 guys a day that I think could be fits for Minnesota at number 17, or if they were to trade up slightly, unlikely, or trade back slightly in the first round. I'm going to start to hit guys that are probably more late first, early second, because I still, like I mentioned last segment, there's a real possibility the Wolves trade back and they end up with a pick between 17 and 31. There's also the ever so slight chance that they maneuver up from 31 or keep 31 and pick there. So it's important to hit guys kind of in that whole range from like 15 to 35, we'll call it. So I've been kind of cherry picking. I started with guys that have been mocked to the Wolves more often than not across the internet. So various mock drafts. And then I'm going to add in some guys that are more likely early second round, late first round guys. So we've talked about Nick Clifford out of Colorado State. We talked about Jace Richardson for Michigan State. Both guys that likely are plus or minus that 17 pick. Asa Newell, same deal. Thomas Sorber, those guys probably go a little bit earlier than 17 or have a real shot to. Maxime Reynaud, who's all over the place on mock. Same with Liam McNeely out of UConn. We talked Drake Powell the other day, somebody who I like a great deal and I think will be there at 17 out of North Carolina. Yegor Demon out of BYU. Ben Serif. Noah Essengay last show on Friday, and then also Danny Wolf on Friday. Today we're going to talk about Adou Thiero. He is a wing out of Arkansas, and he's 6'8", 7-foot wingspan, 21 years old, played 3 years in college, 2 years at Kentucky under John Calipari, and transferred to Arkansas following Calipari there. Great size for a wing, 6'8", 7-foot wingspan, outstanding athleticism. He's an extremely switchable defender. And honestly, this is maybe the third time I think I've said this now in 12 guys, is plug and play as a defender. I said that about Drake Powell as a defender, and I said that about, Nick Clifford would have been the other one. So those 3 guys are all plug and play as defenders. And Adou Thiero, I think, could play right now as a he's got more girth to him, if you will, than Jaden McDaniels, and he's slightly shorter, I think, than Jaden was when he was drafted. Well, Jaden was around 6'8", I guess, when he was drafted. But I think he's that type of an athlete and switchable defender on the perimeter that a team could draft him and be like, all right, you can defend now. I think there's Toumani Camara similarities. Of course, the outstanding young Blazers player, who I believe was a second-round pick. There's some similarity there with how he plays, how he defends, and also the body type. So I really do think that how switchable Thiero is going to be on the perimeter. His off-ball defense would be huge for Minnesota. The steal rate is fantastic. Last season at Arkansas, Adou Thiero had a steal rate of 3.4%. Pick up that steal rate, drop it in the NBA. It would have been third in the entire NBA last season behind just Dyson Daniels, and old friend Chris Dunn would have been ahead of Kaysen Wallace of the NBA champion OKC Thunder. By the way, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Jalen Williams were 9 and 10 in the NBA, and steal rate would have been nearly, actually, a full percentage point ahead of theirs. Of course, that's not quite how it works, but to give some context for just how impressive that steal rate is, got a great nose for the basketball. You'd like the block rate to be a little higher, just given the length and athleticism. Last year, it was 2.9%, which is still really good for a wing. Like SGA's was 3% this year. Draymond Green's was 3.4%. Like, that's not a bad block rate for a wing. You'd like it to be a little higher given the size and athleticism and the fact that he clearly has a nose for the basketball. Everything about the defense is plug and play with Adou Thiero. And I truly believe that. I think the switchability on the perimeter is great. You probably should work on navigating screens, but the physicality is really impressive. The rebound rate is also really good. A 12% overall rebound rate, a defensive rebound rate of just under 16%, which is a really, really nice number to have for somebody who is who's a wing, right? Like he's not a big. That's a nice rebound rate. Nose for the basketball, nose for deflections defensively. All those things are positive. And then on offense, this is of course where the butt comes in. First, the good. He's a pretty good straight line driver. I mean, dude averaged 15 plus points per game last year at Arkansas. He was 15.1 points per game, shot almost 55% from the field, and layups at the rim, shots at the rim in the half court weren't great. He was around 50%. You'd like to see that be higher, but he gets to the rim a fair amount. He gets to the free throw line a lot, 6.5 attempts per game last year, but under 69% at the line. And from the three-point line, he's 25.6% last year. For his college career, he only averaged 1 attempt per game from deep, and he was just 28.4%. That, combined with a free throw percentage of just 69% last year and 71% for his college career, concerns me a little bit about how much development there is on his jumper. The mechanics aren't great. It's a slow release. Like, how much better will he get from the perimeter? But again, the athleticism, the decent first step and really long strides, he can get to the rim fairly easily. And I thought was effective as a straight line driver in college. I think he is functional as a small ball four offensively. Great feeling for timing and spacing as a cutter, massive lob threat. And not that Minnesota plays small a ton, but like I could see him playing the four next to Rudy in a smaller lineup. And yeah, well, that's actually tough having two non-shooters out there. I could see him playing next to Nas, where they kind of could be interchangeable at the 4 and the 5 in a really small lineup. And he's your dunk threat. He's your only guy out there besides Rudy on the team that's not a 3-point shooting threat. And there could be some projectability there too. I think the length, the athleticism, the feel in the half court and in transition, by the way, the ability to play in the dunker, to be a roll man, to be a lob threat, I think that's all real. And I think Thiero can be passable on offense and contribute there because of the feel, the size, the athleticism, and the defense is so good. Like, he's not a day one rotation guy, and he doesn't need to be, because there's other, like, there's some similarities between the way Thiero plays and the way Josh Minott plays. He's not quite as big as Minott, and I think there's maybe a little more offensive polish there. Polish isn't probably the right word to use for Thiero, but I think the straight line drive stuff are not things Josh Minott showed. He was great in transition and maybe had a little more shooting upside. Thiero's better in the half court as just a straight line drive guy and maybe a more polished lob threat, understanding timing, spacing, overall feel on offense. So there are similarities there. But that said, Minott's now 3 years into an NBA career, and he's going to be a step ahead, a couple of steps ahead, hopefully, of Thiero if you were to draft Thiero. But you could draft Thiero and put him on your bench. He's a 12th guy. He plays in the G League. And within a couple of years, he moves into that 10th man role, ninth man role. Do you want to spend the 17th pick on him? No. I don't think so. But could you get him at 31? Maybe. And if you trade back from 17 and get him in the late 20s, I mean, and then trade your 31 pick for a future asset. I think that's a very reasonable way to approach this. And I think it's feasible for Tim Conley to pull something like that off. All right. We'll do a couple more players tomorrow, and then we'll spend Tuesday. Remember, Wednesday is round 1 of the draft. I want to do my big board for the so far 12 guys we've talked about. And I'll give some predictions and what I think will happen before we wrap up this preview series and we get to Wednesday night's round 1. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Reminder that for your second listen, you can check out the 2025 Locked On NBA Mock Draft. It is a 5-episode series with the most comprehensive NBA draft analysis from NBA experts to college experts and NBA draft experts. Find the 2025 Locked On NBA Mock Draft on NBA Big Board and Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.